I saw this animation once, and it gave a great illustration. It said, because we didn't deal with the ideas at this level, and it showed a picture of Mein Kampf of Adolf Hitler, we eventually had to deal with it at this level, and it shows the tanks on the battlefield in the Second World War. Now, I'm not suggesting every idea is going to lead to some kind of conflagration and international conflict necessarily, but certainly ideologically and spiritually is a war going on, isn't it? And that's what we're battling for, is the souls of the people around us.
Socrates said, an unexamined life is not worth living, which would imply an examined life is worth living. C.S. Lewis said, good philosophy must exist, if for no other reason, because bad philosophy needs to be answered. We live in a world full of bad ideas, and ideas have consequences. Available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. If you have not already, like, subscribe, and share this podcast with family and friends. A show where we examine life, contend with philosophies, ideas, and their consequences on today's culture. I am Ryno Femor, and this is Hey Culture. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Hey Culture. I'm really excited about today's episode. We have an amazing guest on, somebody that I had the privilege to meet in person almost a month ago now, Dr. Richard Howe. Dr. Richard, welcome.
Thank you. I was about to turn around and see who it was your guest was, since you said he was amazing. I was thinking, well, that can't be me.
Yeah, and while on that topic, so your full name is Dr. Richard G. Howe, but you mentioned something that the G stands for. What again?
So it's funny because if you don't put the G in, you won't get to the domain exactly. So to help people never forget what the G stands for, I tell them it stands for good looking.
Yeah, I can see that.
For some reason, people laugh when I do that. I go, wait a minute, what's funny about that?
For those of you who are listening to the audio podcast, Dr. Howe really has a beautiful bald head. But yeah, really an amazing person. I think you guys are going to enjoy his humor. Got the privilege to meet both him and his wife when they traveled to South Africa to speak at different conferences and also come and speak and teach at our Bible college. Dr. Howe is part of the family at Southern Evangelical Seminary, part of the faculty there. I'll give over to him in a moment to explain more about what his role is at the seminary. But Dr. Howe has his BA in Bible from Mississippi College, his MA in philosophy from University of Mississippi, and his PhD in philosophy from the University of Arkansas. Both his master's thesis and his doctoral dissertation focuses on the issue of the existence of God. Dr. Howe, would you elaborate a bit on both your theses?
Yeah, well, yes, absolutely. So the master's thesis was particularly on the Kalam cosmological argument. So when I was a graduate student, I stumbled on William Lane Craig's book on the subject titled The Kalam Cosmological Argument, which probably most of your viewers listeners are probably familiar with that, the argument that the universe had a beginning. In the book, he focuses largely on the infinite set theory and transfinite math and these kind of things to make his argument. Now, more often, people appeal to the science to show the beginning of the universe. So when I read the book, I mean, I laughed out loud. It was so good. I thought it was just a tremendous read. So what I wanted to do in my thesis was defend the argument against objections that had come out against the book after the book was published, and also objections that I actually encountered as I would give the argument in various venues, and see if I could extend the argument a little bit more to round out, for example, dealing with things like, well, the argument doesn't prove whether there's only one cause of the universe. The argument doesn't prove whether the cause of the universe is good or evil. These kinds of things. Doesn't prove whether the cause of the universe still exists today. Maybe the cause existed when it caused and then it ceased to exist. Those kind of objections I tried to deal with in that one. And so even though it wasn't a plan, when I got to Arkansas, I was doing my PhD, and I wanted to do something in Thomas Aquinas, and I chose to focus on the second of his 5 ways, the famous 5 ways of Thomas Aquinas. The second of the 5 arguments for God's existence is efficient causality. So I decided to focus on that. And so retrospectively, I thought, wow, it kind of does make great pairs, if you will, make a great pair in that one's dealing with the coming into existence of the universe. The other is dealing with the continued sustaining existence of the universe.
That is amazing.
Yeah, so they really complement one another. There, what I did was tried to defend the argument against three levels of objections, against arguments against theistic arguments, broadly speaking, whether it's even appropriate to try to give arguments for God's existence, and then objections, if you will, or arguments against cosmological style of those arguments, and then last, specific objections to Aquinas's cosmological version. So that's what I tried to do in my dissertation. I'm one of those rare people, at least in my experience, that made it all the way through the PhD without growing weary of your dissertation topic. I knew so many people along the way that halfway through, they're so saturated and tired of the subject that they can't wait to finish writing their dissertation, get their degree, and then move on. But by God's grace, I was able to focus on things. I mean, who can get tired of arguments for God's existence, right? If you're doing apologetics. So I was blessed in that regard.
Amen to that. To some of our viewers who aren't familiar with Thomas Aquinas, shortly, just who is he and why is he so important? Yeah.
So Aquinas was a 13th century Dominican friar. Before the Protestant Reformation, pretty much everybody was either Catholic or Orthodox. You were either East or West, and that was about it. And Aquinas really is the zenith of this classical philosophical tradition that you find grounded in the ancient Greeks, Plato and Aristotle, and other voices have contributed to the conversation. But most people who like Aquinas would probably regard him as the greatest Christian philosopher of all time, if you will. But one thing to watch out for, I've noticed this, for reasons that we may or may not touch on in our subject today, the influence of Aquinas began to wane, probably about the maybe 17th century, maybe a little bit later, 18th century in Protestantism, right? So today, if you hear a Christian extolling the virtues of Thomas Aquinas, almost certainly that Christian will be Catholic and not Protestant. And so, understandably, many Protestants today associate Aquinas with Catholicism. I mean, indeed, a lot of his theology is what we would identify as Catholic, and among many things that the Protestants rejected in Catholicism. But his philosophical doctrines and things weren't that. The Protestants didn't rebel against the scholasticism, as it's sometimes called. At least not in total, they didn't do that. It was a spectrum. So you still find it well into the 17th century in some vestigial form by that time, perhaps, in Protestantism. All that's to say, you can be a thoroughgoing Protestant and committed philosophically to the metaphysics of Aquinas without really betraying the cause of Protestantism.
Yeah, as your case in point in that regard.
Mm-hmm. And it's growing. I mean, things are changing because there's a growing contingent, certainly in the United States, of Reformed Protestants, including out of the Dutch Reformed tradition, as well as other sort of tributaries of Reformed thought, who are very enthusiastic about Aquinas.
And also the work that you guys do over at SCS, where I have a privilege of being a student of, the work that you guys do is also laying the groundwork to spread Thomism as it is. Will you tell us a bit more about Southern Evangelical and the role that you have there and the vision of the seminary?
Sure. Yeah. So our seminary was co-founded by Norman Geisler. He's a more familiar name in American circles, but he's considered by many one of the best, if not the best, Christian apologists of the 20th and into the early part of the 21st century. And he co-founded the Southern Evangelical Seminary in the early 1990s. Well, Norm Geisler was very much steeped in the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas and saw its value not only for apologetics, things like the cosmological argument or dealing with the problem of evil or whatever, but also for sound theology. One of the things that grieves me is the increasing erosion of classical theism as it's come to be known. This idea that God has the attributes that we've traditionally thought, omniscience, omnipotence, simplicity, impassibility, all these superlatives that we attribute to God, and they're fading away in Protestantism, certainly in the US. So now there's an ongoing battle on YouTube between the classical theists, as they are self-identified, and then The detractors refer to the other side as the theistic personalism. So we would argue at SES that the best metaphysics, the best philosophy to undergird not only questions about God's existence, but also his nature, is the metaphysics of Aquinas. So our Thomism infuses everything we do, because we're not just a philosophy / apologetics seminary. As being a seminary, we do a lot of theology, right? So, but it undergirds our theological paradigms, it undergirds our apologetic method, and it undergirds our philosophical approaches and stuff. So that's what we're all about. We're the DNA of Norman Geisler. He's gone to be with the Lord now. And those of us who were his disciples, he was my mentor when I studied under him at Dallas Theological Seminary back in the 1980s. And if you'd have told me back then that, hey, someday you're going to be teaching alongside Norman Geisler at his seminary, I mean, that would be, and maybe this will be lost on some of your younger viewers, but that would be like somebody telling me, hey, the Beatles want you to sit in and play drums for a while, or something. It's like, no way, man. Because he was like all four Beatles wrapped into one as far as his stature to me as a young apologetic student. So that's what we're trying to do. And I think we're very closely unique among seminaries in the U.S. that tout this classical tradition. I sort of call it the classical tradition. It sounds more sort of innocuous, and it doesn't throw up these unfamiliar terms like Thomism. I mean, we're not ashamed of the word, obviously, but I like the word classical. It sounds innocent enough that maybe somebody go, well, what do you mean by classical? And then we try to unpack. We try to do theology and philosophy and apologetics largely in the categories, philosophical categories of Greek philosophy, that we'll maybe get into some of that, maybe in a future podcast. But that's what we try to do. And it's, as I said, it's a growing contingent now in the U.S. We can't take credit for all that's going on in that direction, but I've noticed a lot more coming on board for classical theism, and very often a classical theism informed by the metaphysics of Thomas Aquinas.
So for you guys out there, if you're looking to have a great graduate education and even PhD, I think SES is definitely a place that you can go and look, and you can join us at studying there.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah, we offer the first parts of an undergraduate. This will be using the U.S. categories. And then we offer graduate degrees in apologetics and philosophy and theology. And then we offer a PhD in philosophy of religion, which really is full-on Thomistic metaphysics and how it informs philosophy of religion.
Okay.
So you can go
cool.
to ses.edu and find out. You can even take classes as audit if you're not necessarily interested in a degree. I've got a class coming up in October, not to timestamp our talk today, but it's coming up October 2024 in classical philosophy. And we get this A to Z basically at the fundamental level of our approach.
That's amazing. Yeah, so I'll definitely put a link into the description. So if you guys are interested, I would encourage you to go over to that link and check SES out. Dr. Howe, I forgot to mention that when you came to South Africa, you're part of a formidable team for the Christian faith. You brought your wife Rebecca along, and it's really been a blessing to meet you guys. And for the viewers, I'm really excited. And we have future episodes coming up where Rebecca would also be speaking to me on some of the topics that is in her repertoire. But today we are mainly speaking about postmodernism. Mm-hmm. And I think you are, from the people in my circles that I've met, I think you're the perfect person to speak on this. But what is postmodernism?
Okay, well, it is a relatively complex, there's a spectrum of ideas that kind of fall under this penumbra, but get right to the heart of it. Post, of course, the combining form post means after. So postmodernism means after modernism. So someone have to go, okay, well now what is modernism then? So that we can understand what after modernism is, and what does that even mean to be after it? Because it's more than just a chronological temporal kind of thing, that it just chronologically came after whatever modernism is. So modernism is typically regarded as associated with the Enlightenment, with the rise of the scientific method, and in the revolution of the sciences in the 17th century. And I mean, the roots of it go back further, but we really see it start to flourish the end of the 16th into the 17th century with Galileo, and then all of the luminaries in the 17th century that had the sciences, people like Descartes as the father of analytic geometry, or Robert Boyle and Boyle's laws of gases. They started studying all these things, inertia, all these kind of ideas start to flourish. So that's just kind of a demarcation, and typically it's distinguished from, and this is a very tendentious and I think erroneous characterization, but it's characterized as distinct from the Dark Ages, right? So you got the ancient era, and then the Dark Ages, which is more than a millennium, and then of course the Enlightenment. You can see how prejudicial the terminology is. And I'm all in favor of the scientific revolution as far as it goes. I mean, I love air conditioning and automobiles and cell phones and StreamYard and every kind of technology and application you can think of.
When they work.
Yeah, when it works. That's like when it works. It's like we're worse off when your computer breaks down than you were before there was such thing as computers.
That's true.
So, but here's the thing that causes, if you will, postmodernism, because there became this sentiment that rightly or wrongly was associated with the scientific approach. And I think to some degree it was right to characterize it this way, and in another sense it was wrong. We'll get into maybe that. And it was this, that the scientific method and the emphasis on the sciences and the natural sciences and things like that seemed to understate what it is to be a human being, the inner life of a human being, the things that deal with issues of meaning and purpose, and where did we come from, where are we going? And I think a lot of people thought that the scientific method literally left that cold, because all it could say was, well, we came basically from nothing and we're going to end up in heat death and end up nowhere, and in between it's just all vanity, if you will. And now again, that may be fair to say about some aspects of quote modernism and unfair about other aspects, but be that as it may. Now, I think you and I and your viewers who are Christians will say, yes, to the extent that it focuses entirely on the natural realm to the exclusion of the supernatural, to God and his claims on our life, to the extent that it does that, it does understate what it means to be a human, right? But the postmodernists, as we now call them, rather than reverting back to the answer that was already there before the modernism came on, namely the claims of Christ, who is God, who is Jesus, what did he do for us, that kind of stuff, rather than go back to that, I say they go one step deeper into the darkness, away from this modernism. So what was it that about the modernism they didn't like? We'll probably pick up on a few things as we go along. But probably one of them that's the most conspicuous to us as apologists is their sort of explicit and sometimes implicit rejection of there being an objective truth about a matter. So postmodernism in most people's minds is immediately associated with some form of like a relativism with respect to truth. Specifically, not just relativism with respect to morals, which had already been a problem for decades, if not more than a century in Western thought, battling moral relativism. This relativism about truth was a new kid on the block, so to speak, and it's all often associated with postmodern. So we can get into maybe some specifics as we go along about who are some of these thinkers and what did they actually say and such. But I think that's the nutshell, is this repudiation of objective, factual, unbiased observations that give us truth about reality.
Is that where we get slogans such as that is true for you but not for me, or there is no such thing as truth?
Absolutely. That's exactly, especially that's true for you not for me, because the way we might understandably say that about taste in food. So someone may say, I really like Brussels sprouts or asparagus or whatever, and someone else goes, well, that tastes good to you but doesn't taste good to me. That makes perfect sense. I think we're used to the fact that different people like different foods, they like different styles of music, they like different fashion, whatever it is. So we're already used to the fact that something could be, if you will, relative to the individual. So it's not universally true that asparagus tastes good. It's just relative to the person eating it, right? We're already used to that. Well, you take that sentiment and try to map it on factual things like, is the sun the center of the solar system? Well, it wouldn't make sense to say, well, it's the center of the solar system for you, but not for me. Okay. So we might pick perhaps an uncontroversial example that maybe even a postmodernist would grant. Oh, I'll grant that the sun is the center of the solar system. But the problem is, between this relatively uncontroversial, now it used to be controversial, relatively uncontroversial, the sun is the center of the solar system on one end, and the uncontroversial asparagus tastes good to me on the other end, fall a lot of important things. I remember, by the way, when I was a student of Norm Geisler in the 80s, he told the story of giving a talk, and I think it was on the resurrection at a university campus. And when he got finished, and students coming up to him, this student came up to him and she said, well, that's your truth, but it's not my truth, regarding the resurrection and the implications that has for who Jesus is and the implications that has for his claims on your life. And that was his first encounter in the 1980s with this kind of epistemological relativism, if you will. And that's exactly what that was. It was now this postmodern that had been percolating in the ivory towers of universities was now, again, percolating down and dripping down to the marketplace. And people were starting to pick up on these things. Paul Copan has a great book called True for You, But Not for Me, on that very subject, dealing with these. How do you respond to that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I'll definitely have a look at Paul Copan's book. If I remember in the book of James Sile, Universe Next Door, he uses on his chapter in Postmodernism, you just mentioned like it was percolating in the ivory towers amongst the scholarly elite, people like Derrida and so forth. But it was like, he mentions like water dripping and trickling until it built up a huge force, and now it's just flooded everywhere. And I think we live in a culture today where postmodernism has flooded into people. People are quoting and saying things that are postmodern, but they don't necessarily realize it. That is how they kind of it became a custom of today.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, absolutely. When these things were going on in the university ivory towers, as we say, not surprisingly, the man on the street, just the rest of us, so to speak, the normal people out in the marketplace, were relatively indifferent, perhaps ignorant of it, indifferent to it, because it struck no one as anything important or practical, right? That happens a lot, I think, in the history of ideas, where ideas that are being bandied about by scholars in a certain field, which would strike people who aren't scholars in that particular field, or maybe not scholars at all, it strikes them as irrelevant to life. Eventually, however, you begin to see the fruit of these ideas. They have consequences, it's often said, ideas have consequences. By that time, though, the consequences make the dealing with the ideas a real felt need. Like all of a sudden we got to deal with it. We've lost a lot of ground, haven't we? In terms of how much time this had to take root in culture. And then now it's a felt need enough that people are starting. This is what happened with the whole transgender things that's going on, the Marxism, all the stuff that we're battling in Western culture right now. Those things have been going on to some degree in some ivory towers in Western thought as far back as the 30s, in some respects, more explicitly, the 1930s. So here we are almost 100 years later. Now we're suffering under this. Same thing with postmodernism. And it's self-serving for me to say, but I think about things that as a philosopher, I see being wrestled with, that you want to tell your fellow Christian in the pew that isn't particularly interested in academics. You want to warn them, and you try to get them to see, we need to start dealing with this now before it gets to be such a felt need. I saw this animation once, and it gave a great illustration. It said, because we didn't deal with the ideas at this level, and it showed a picture of Mein Kampf of Adolf Hitler. we eventually had to deal with it at this level, and it shows the tanks on the battlefield in the Second World War. Now, I'm not suggesting every idea is going to lead to some kind of conflagration and international conflict necessarily, but certainly ideologically and spiritually is a war going on, isn't it? And that's what we're battling for, is the souls of the people around us.
And yeah, there's definitely a war, and there's a war on truth, and there's a war for truth. And so a couple of episodes ago, I did an episode with Dr. Howe on Marxism, and he also said that this is definitely a war in our culture, and it's not a war that we started as Christians, but it's definitely a war we have to take part in to see it going to a better end. I think that's the whole idea of this podcast of hate culture, is the fact that ideas have consequences, and to deal with these consequences and deal with these ideas. And I think you beautifully summed up why it's important to deal with ideas, especially when it's on a smaller level before it escalates.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that's probably the most familiar to us right now in the nature of this debate is those elements of postmodern thinking who largely regard disputes over truth to merely be disputes over power. This is what the identity politics is about. This was Foucault's view, for example. So that idea then is, if you tried to make an argument, let's say, for pro-life against abortion, then someone influenced by this postmodern notion will in effect disregard your arguments that demonstrate that the conceptus, the zygote, the fetus, whatever you want to call it, is a human being. They'll disregard the arguments because they will have already taken the very fact that you're arguing as an attempt to leverage political power to subjugate them below you and control them. They already do that. So they're not even inclined to hear an argument, because they take argument already to be a political move. And again, that's the identity politics does that very thing. So now we're almost put at a disadvantage, because the very idea of bringing up a dispute about having disputes about ideas is already preempted. And in some places in the world now, people are getting in legal trouble. I know in Canada, some pastors have been arrested for not using the proper pronoun, for goodness sake. They're put in jail because they used the wrong pronoun. And you go, wow, how did that ever happen? Well, because this idea that the battles, if you will, intellectual battles for truth, are actually explicit, if not implicit, sometimes battles over political force. And so we've got to fight it with political force by putting people in jail and these kinds of things. Now, as I indicated from my illustration a while ago, we were driven to that in the Second World War, but the Second World War was a defensive war by and large, wasn't it? It was the Nazis who started that thing. It was the Allies who decided to stop it. So I'm not suggesting we go out and pick physical battles with people, but we got to do the battle at the level of the ideas. Otherwise, there's the danger that it will eventually come to the latter.
Yeah, that is true. That is so true. You just mentioned the people being arrested in Canada. I thought the stories I heard about Canada was bad until I see what recently was starting to take place in the UK. With I don't know if you followed what is taking place in the UK, where people are literally arrested for what they're posting online. If anything sounds Islamophobic, they are arrested. They're actually releasing hardened criminals to make place for these people who are guilty of misinformation, type of thing. It looks like 1984 became a real thing and not just fiction. But yeah, it is horrible.
And once a given idea gains total political power, then they can retire at their convenience any kind of postmodernism, right? They're no longer obligated to have to go, well, that's true for you, but not for me. Once you've got all the political powers, then you can just tell everybody else, no, it's true for you too, whether you like it or not, and we'll make it true for you. There's a political commentator in the U.S. who wrote a book called "You Will Be Made to Care," And it was basically about the fact that the homosexual movement in the United States wasn't going to stop with, hey, just live and let live. Let us have our lifestyle and we'll stop there. No, no, no. It's more, they don't want, at least some segments of it. It's not enough that we let them have their lifestyle, whatever that means. They want to punish people who don't like the fact that they have that lifestyle. And then in the case in the UK, you can see this trend towards the caliphate. That's what the caliphate will do. It's no longer, well, you know, everybody has their own religion. No, you're going to get imprisoned, if not executed, if you don't succumb to the will of Allah through the auspices of the caliphate. So it's odd, isn't it? Because you go, well, that's anything but postmodern. That's a totalitarian kind of thing. It's not a true for you, but not for me. It's true for me, and I'm going to make it true for you kind of mentality. But of course, that only happens once they garner enough political power.
Yes, is that kind of where?
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry. No. Sorry. Is that kind of where there's a bit of an overlap between the Marxist ideas and the postmodern ideas when they?
It certainly seems like that. I'm not an expert in Marxism beyond what I think a lot of people know because it's been forced on us. But yes, I think so. You know, the idea has been for a long time. You have the Marxist revolution, and it overthrows a particular country, let's say, and then the leadership who have the power kill all the people who led the revolution, because they already realized, well, these are the people that forced this new paradigm on everybody. What's to keep them from overthrowing us? And so they kill whomever doesn't, fall into line. Now that may be an extreme example, but you could take whatever kind of illustration you want from these physical things of warfare and such, and transfer them to the ideological, that is, the ideas, and in the spiritual realm. It absolutely is a war there. There, though, the weapons are spiritual, and they're tearing down arguments, as 2 Corinthians 10 says, and bringing thoughts into subjection. That's all done by doing what you're doing through your ministry and teaching there in South Africa of critiquing ideas and things like that. That's how this battle goes. And we want to keep it at that level as much as we can and try to win people's hearts.
That is true. You just mentioned about like these ideas being forced upon us, and so I was on a Afrikaans podcast a couple of months ago that two friends of mine run, but it's a podcast where they chat about anything and everything, and they interviewed me a bit about my podcast, and as I was mentioning things such as postmodernism and Marxism, one of my two friends, one of the co-hosts, he studied filmmaking at an arts college, and he was just shaking his head saying almost every assignment, no matter what subject he took, Marxism and postmodernism was in it. And so thinking about how people are basically being indoctrinated at university level, who were some of the people who advocated these ideas? Because just if there are parents out there or even university students as they are going through their studies, what should they be looking out for in terms of names, in terms of even phrases?
Yeah, so we mentioned Foucault. Here's a quote from him, if you'll indulge me. This is Michel Foucault, who died in 1984, French existentialist philosopher. He may be characterized, certainly one of the pioneers of postmodern thought. He says, there is a battle for truth, or at least around truth. It being understood once again that by truth, I do not mean the assemblage of truths that are to be discovered and accepted, but rather the assemblage of rules according to which the true and the false are separated, and specific effects of power are attached to the true. So we separate true and false, give them those names, and then true then has a certain power attached to that. And that's what he thinks is actually going on. That's probably one of the more explicit references to the connection of some postmodern thought with the idea of, in effect, political power. Some of them are much more innocuous. Like Richard Rorty says, philosophy is edifying discourse, the purpose of which is to finding new, better, and more fruitful ways of speaking, and to keep the conversation going rather than finding objective truth. In fact, in another context, he uses the idea that, Well, what we're trying to do is in our conversations, we want to extend the notion of us as far as possible. In other words, it's not so much let's find what's true about reality and through argument and reason and discourse convince people that that's the truth about reality, and then that creates this uniformity, if we will. We all think the sun is the center of the solar system, for example. Oh, no, it's not that. It's through other means of achieving this uniformity of idea. And in the presentation I do, where we talk about some of this stuff, and I'm using slides and such, the next slide after that quote from Rorty, I have a picture of, you've seen some of these photographs early in the Nazi movement at Nuremberg, where it's just a sea of soldiers all the way to the horizon, it looks like, standing in formation, rank and file, and with the big swastika on the building behind them or in front of them as they're facing it. And I say basically, I would like to think that this isn't the notion of us that Rorty had in mind. In other words, the Nazis achieved a pretty wide berth of what constitutes us, this uniformity. But it was a uniformity in violation to what was true, good, and beautiful, right? So rather than spending efforts to discover and defend and persuade people to what's true, what's good, and what's beautiful, we just want to persuade people that it's almost a sophism in some respects, regardless of whether what they're doing is true and good and beautiful, which it obviously wasn't with the Nazis and such. So there are a lot of, you mentioned Derrida earlier. My brother, Tom Howe, wrote his dissertation, and it was published as the book Objectivity in Biblical Interpretation. What's startling is when Derrida was sort of the father of some of these ideas in terms of how they are connected to language and hermeneutics. And he discovered in his dissertation research, out of about 40 something conservative Protestant theologians who wrote on hermeneutics, not just used hermeneutics, but actually wrote on the subject. Out of about 40 or so, he found only 2 that believed there was objective truth that you could get from written text. And I remember some years ago, I know I talk too much when you ask me a question, so you cut me off anytime.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, that's right. I tell some of my students, I'm threatening to start a podcast just titled "More Than You Wanted to Know." It's like, okay, that's probably more than But I remember some years ago, I was sitting in my office on the seminary campus, and these 2 women came in, Christians, and they were both teachers at a Christian school in the city where the seminary was, in Charlotte, North Carolina. And they wanted to talk to my brother Tom Howe about some of the stuff he was writing or whatever. And I said, well, he's not in the office today. You got Howe number 2 here. So we sat down, and these teachers said, we train our students at our Christian school in apologetics. They know the cosmological arguments and the design argument and the problem of evil response and whatever. And they're loaded for bear. And then they go off to university and they're being stumbled in their faith in the English department. And I was like, okay, what is, I figured they say, and in the science because of evolution, or in the philosophy because of atheism. No, the English department. What in the world's going on in an English department? And it turns out one of the 2 women was actually working on her master's degree in English as she was teaching at this school. And they said the students are learning in the university that when you come to a written text, you bring to that text your own life experiences, your own, if you will, bias. You bring that to the text. And when you read the text, whatever is in the text is married with whatever your life experience is, and you sort of construct this truth out of that. I just heard Bart Ehrman just recently. I heard it recently. I don't know that he said it recently. When he was asked directly, are you postmodern? And he said, he kind of laughed, said, it's a complicated question. He said, but I'm going to give you a confusing answer. And his confusing answer was, in many respects, I am postmodern. But the confusing part was, despite the fact that I work in an area where I try to find out what happened in the past by looking at the evidence. It's like, that doesn't sound very postmodern when you frame it that way. Bart
No, it doesn't.
Ehrman was on our campus, just to kind of highlight this point. He was on our campus in the seminary to have a debate. And during the Q&A, Tom, having done his work in postmodern hermeneutics, asked Bart Ehrman, if you say that when I come to the text, I change the meaning, I marry it to the bias of my own life experience. This is called historicism by some postmodern defenders. Then how, if that's true, how am I going to understand what you're telling me in your book, since I'm changing the meaning of your book? And Bart said, that's a good question, and it's kind of complicated. Perhaps I can send you an email. To which Tom went, well, how am I going to understand your email? And the whole audience just guffawed, and they just burst out in laughter. And I venture to guess that Bart really didn't know what people found funny about that. He didn't see the self-refuting. Yeah, but you can't send me an email to the effect of how I can wade my way through reading a text and get the meaning out of it if I can't even do that with the very email you're sending to tell me how to do that in the first place. That, I submit to you, is the influence of, among a number of things, including postmodernism. This sort of relativism. Here, it's just in terms of how it's affecting deleteriously the idea of hermeneutics and the interpretation of spoken or written text.
Do you think then, seeing as it wasn't so obvious maybe to him how self-refuting the statement was, do you think if at a young level we teach children how to think critically and how to think logically, that would kind of safeguard them against deceptive ideas like these in the future?
Absolutely. And I have said many times, as others at our seminary have said in the faculty, one of the most useful skills, I think, comes out of studying Christian apologetics and critical thinking and logic and these kind of things. One of the most useful skills is being able to detect self-refuting statements. We can come up with obvious ones that actually sound like jokes, like somebody says, I cannot speak a word in English. And of course, everyone laughs because you just spoke that in English. It's self-refuting. Or there are no truths. Oh, was that a truth? But I mean, you would be astounded, I think, people would be, you wouldn't be, but people would be who are just now learning about this, how some of this trickles even into Christian thought, where people like Stanley Grins, I won't bore you with some of my quotes, but I've got quotes from people like Stanley Grins, Dan McGee, and Robert Weber. And in every one of these instances, they make the statement, well, everything that we say and read is conditioned by its history and its context and the bias of the person, blah, 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 to which you want to go, well, what about that statement you just made? You just made a statement that purports to be an objective statement about how things really are. But how things really are for you is there are no objective statements that state how things really are. Flagrant, well, I started to say flagrant, but maybe not so flagrant, unfortunately. But it seems flagrant to perhaps to you and me and your viewers because we've been trafficking in this, but it's not obvious to a lot of people. And they're vulnerable to this. They read a book, oh, that sounds real humble. We all kind of have and I can't just say that I'm absolutely right. I got to, you go, no, this is toxic. Sure, there are some things about which we can have different relative opinions, whether asparagus tastes good or not. All right. But there are some things that are facts about reality. We could be wrong about those facts, but it can't be a fact one way to one person and a different way to another person. It can't be the sun is the center of the solar system for me, but not for you. It's just a fact. So translated to what we care about in this context, it either is true or it's not true that God exists. It either is true or it's not true that Jesus rose from the dead. And so that's what we're trying to help people understand, that what we're saying is not a philosophy that you can choose to live according to, and it, take it or leave it if it does you well in your life. No, these are facts that we're leveraging. That's what we're trying to argue. If you think we're wrong, then bring your argument and let's have the discussion. But we're making claims about objective reality. So yeah, to your point, I think it's so valuable for people to study logic and critical thinking, not to be confused with critical theory. It's just a different use of the word critical.
Totally different.
It means subject to critique. Critical thinking means you don't just believe everything you hear. Someone says something, you go, okay, what is your evidence? What's your argument? Why should I think that's true? Kind of attitude, right? And that's what critical thinking does. And there are skills that people can develop to that end.
Yes, there's definitely. So taking what you just said, and you take for the viewers out there, if somebody comes to you with that slogan that this is true to you but not to me, one of the easiest ways to show the self-refuting nature of that statement is to ask them, but is that true?
Absolutely. Yeah,
because
absolutely.
They're making an objective truth statement to say that there isn't such a thing as objective truth.
Well, I wonder what someone would say. Go, well, if they said to me, well, that's true for you, but not for me. And I went, no, it's only true for you, but not for me. That is true for you, not for me. But for me, it's not true for you, not for me. For me, it's true for me and true for you too. What could they say? I could just turn it right back on them.
But what I don't know about you, but what I've seen in my personal experience with some people who are a bit postmodern in that regard, saying these things, they are usually the people who shout and call for tolerance. They're usually the people who say, don't shove your views down my throat. But they're also usually the people who they actually want to make truth statements. They just want to shut you up.
That is a great observation, I think. In fact, it reminds me of a book that came out probably in the 80s. It was by a guy named William Watkins, who was another student of Geisler, same time I was. Bill and I were at Dallas Seminary at the same time. He wouldn't remember me, but I remember him. But he wrote a book titled The New Absolutes, because in an ironic kind of way, all of this posturing as, well, let's be tolerant and entertain all points of view and everything's true for whomever, blah, 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 was a subtle form of totalitarianism lurking underneath that was going to subjugate everybody else's so that they can have the different view that they want. Not that they shouldn't have it because it's not true, but you can't have it because we won't allow you. And he argued that this is really a subtle form of a surrogate absolutism coming in. All they've done is exchange the absolutes of the Christian faith with the absolutes of their secular faith, if you will. But so it's almost a totalitarian.
Yeah, and to kind of quote, or in the words of our mutual friend Simon Brace, that is exactly what Jordan Peterson is crying about day and night on YouTube, is the totalitarian nature of Marxism and postmodernism out there. I don't know. Have you seen Jordan Peterson's, it's a satire video called The Postmodern Drinking Song?
I need to. I haven't seen it, though.
I'll send it to you on WhatsApp, then you can have a look.
Excellent.
But it's good. So it's to show the absurdity of everything is really good.
Excellent. Sounds really great. Good. I look forward to that.
To go on to one of our last few questions, we've touched on some, but what are the consequences of these ideas of postmodernism, and what does it hold for society at large?
Well, let's just start with the most serious consequence. We know as Christians that everybody's going to be somewhere for eternity, either in communion with God in heaven or separated from God in hell. And so that's the ultimate consequences, and the problem, or the challenge, maybe problem might not be the right word, but the challenge is some ideas, the bankruptcy of some ideas might not be obvious until the next life, right? So if people are going to go, well, I'm a pragmatist, I'm just going to see how things work out. Yeah, well, the problem is you might not know how badly that idea worked out until you're dead and in hell. There's got to be some way prior to judgment where we can leverage the case and show people somehow that their ideas are leading to their eternal demise. But pending that debate, suppose we're talking in a theater where people aren't particularly convinced that there is this afterlife. Okay, so we go, okay, we can have that discussion too. But even pending that, there are a lot of more proximate consequences. I mean, we've already made allusion to the fact, or actually an explicit reference to the fact, that the ideas of Mein Kampf, which were written in a jail cell and put in a book, right? So they're just ideas at that level, ultimately have the consequences of the Holocaust. and regardless of what someone may want to think about the afterlife, which we think is the most important question, we'll never table that, except momentarily for the sake of argument. We're going to get them back to that because that's the one that ultimately matters. But pending that for the time being, this something like the Holocaust, that's a here and now consequence where people are slaughtered because of the deleterious. Now, I suppose I sound to somebody like, well, if you read Foucault, you're going to go out and start a Holocaust of your own. It's like, no, I'm not saying that necessarily. The cause and effect chain may be strewn out over generations. In fact, oftentimes they're over centuries. With social media and the internet and all the kind of stuff that goes along with it, it's expedited it. So sometimes bad ideas get a lot more traction a lot more quickly than they used to. But nevertheless, you have these short-term deleterious consequences that we're battling in the whole woke movement there, which, as I said, it's not content with live and let live. It's insistent on imperializing over the entire conversation and incarcerating those who don't like, you almost, if you scour your brow, you're almost like, oh, well, you've offended me, or I'm offended by your what you're wearing because it reminds me of something. It's like you can hardly move without somebody being offended. It's always offended in one direction. It seems like it's always this one direction. It's always going to be the political conservative and or Christian, Judeo-Christian heritage that's vilified as the one thing that needs to be eradicated. Which I think, by the way, is a telltale sign of who's behind all of this. And you go, it's a conspicuous pattern to exactly who's branded the bad guys, and it's always the Christian and the Christian implications for the social life, the natural law theory. It's always going to be that thing that's in the crosshairs of these movements. So in the United States, it's we're fighting this battle. So far, it's we're staving the tide against it going so far as it has in Canada and the UK. But there are enclaves in the US where you would be alarmed as to how bad the darkness is gaining ground. So pray for the US in this regard, because we're fighting it. And I know you guys are fighting it in South Africa for sure. There, and that's probably a lot our fault. I think a lot of times we're the sewage line. So what the ideas that deserve to be flushed down the toilet finally find their way to other parts of the world, thanks to our export capabilities. We not only give you Kentucky Fried Chicken, but we give you woke. You get it all from us, I guess.
I don't think it's entirely what we face is entirely your fault. Yes, maybe the postmodernism and the moral relativism that is creeping in, but
and it comes from Europe anyway, so we could blame. We
can blame Europe. Oh, I think we can blame Germany and France in a lot regards, because
there you go.
Because Immanuel Kant is everywhere in South Africa. Karl Marx is everywhere in our government and everywhere in South Africa.
Yeah, and it's that continental philosophy. See, you need the classical tradition to stand against it.
We do, and I'm looking forward for the viewers. We're going to have an episode just on Immanuel Kant. Looking forward to that as well. Dr. Richard, your wife likes to play this video clip of John Cooper of the band Skillet, where he says we have to declare war.
Yes.
And that is where we are. We are on a culture war. We are on a spiritual war. How do we fight this war as Christians?
So one of the things that grieves me, and I know it grieves you and the other leaders that I know down there, is the degree to which the alarms that we're sounding is falling on deaf ears in the local church, or if one is in a ecclesiastical situation where they're a local church under a synod or whatever, however you want to demarcate the local assemblage of Christians and such. So it's sad and alarming, the dearth of awareness of the problem out there. Now, of course, there's a lot of churches that are part of the vanguard leading the battle, local churches, but it's got to start, I think, in the local church pew, in the leadership of equipping people. And Ryno, it's tough because there's so many resources on the internet. A lot of them are bad resources. So even trying to find good tools, one still has to be discriminating about what is a better tool than something else, or what is a good tool versus a bad tool. But that's a conversation for another time, perhaps. But we've got to educate our own in that regard. Unfortunately, I think certainly in the U.S., that has over the past couple, maybe two centuries in the U.S., that has taken the shape of, well, if you really want to know this kind of stuff, go to seminary. And so the guy in the pew goes, well, I don't feel called to the ministry, or I don't want to go to seminary, which then ends up making it where they don't have access to what you might only find in a seminary course, because it's not going on. I tell my students, when the occasion happens and I bring up a writer named Stephen Charnock, and he wrote a book titled, or there is a book titled, Discourses Upon the Existence and Attributes of God. And I tell you, the only place you're going to find that as a resource in your normal course of life is if you take a graduate or above level theology or philosophy of religion course. That's the only place you'll find that book. But all the book is a collection of sermons that he preached to 17th century English farmers. In other words, just normal people. That was the staple of their sermon. In my experience, if you tried to preach that kind of depth on theology proper, people would leave the church. They go, it's too hard. Granted, it probably would be too hard given how far we've gone. So obviously you don't give a steak to an infant who doesn't even have teeth yet, obviously. But what happened to make at least American Christianity so shallow that what passed for 17th century normal staple that the army of God was feeding on, the rations they're feeding on to fight the spiritual battle, what went from that to what it is today is, it's an interesting story, but it's a hard thing to push back against. It didn't happen overnight, and we're not going to change it overnight. But it starts with one person, one church at a time, I think.
Sure. But with what you said as to how the depth, how that gone away and how it became, I think it's not just in Christianity, but in our culture as a whole. I don't know. Are you familiar with Matt Walsh and the Daily Wire?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I love Matt Walsh. Yeah.
Yeah, me too. I think you would enjoy his humor. But
I do.
I'm looking forward to his documentary, Am I a Racist? That's coming out pretty soon. But
yes,
he read on one of his podcast episodes, he read a letter that I think, if I remember correctly, was the boy was a farmhand who was fighting in the American Civil War, and he wrote back home to his family to tell them how it's going with him. But the eloquency and poetry that he used in the letter was next level, whereas to us today, people aren't using that type of language anymore. That's not the way people are speaking anymore. If I just take my own language, Afrikaans is a pretty young language. I think it's a couple 100 years old, and even so, it's already being, some of the vocabulary is disappearing. Just the other day, John was John, he was teaching at the Bible College in a first year class, and the majority of the students is Afrikaans. John himself is English, and he used an Afrikaans word. The Afrikaans word is verregaande. In English, it's the word for ridiculous. And the students looked at him and they didn't know what that word meant. And he's like, he's not even Afrikaans, and they don't know what it means. So,
and the reason that matters, it seems like, people may say, well, language is kind of fluid, it changes. But the problem is, what you're pointing out is a symptom of the fact that languages are going in a direction that makes it harder and harder for the language to shoulder complex thoughts. And so a more robust language is better at managing and navigating complexity of human thinking. But as the language gets weaker in that regard, as the scaffolding gets weaker, it can't really hold up complex thought. It dumbs people's thinking skills down. They can't think complex thoughts because they can't they've never learned how to speak them and articulate them in their own language. That's when you said what you did about the eloquence of the letter from the farmer in the Civil War. It reminds me, there's a book, I think it's a PDF now on the internet, it's public domain, and it's a pretty thick book, and it's an ongoing debate, went on over the course of weeks between two different theological models. Okay, it was having to do with water baptism and ordination and these kind of issues in 19th century American arguments going on. But what's astounding about the book, before you even get to the whole point of the book, the front of it are the personal correspondence between the potential interlocutors as they were trying to plan the format and the exact subject, and we're going to do this. Just reading their letters, like you said here, of this young man writing from the battlefield, just their letters, not their polemic, where they're really trying to think through. This is just their normal discourse. It's just it is a banquet of eloquent English. I mean, I was just astounded reading it. I got, man, I'm just embarrassed sometimes to read something I wrote in a normal letter. Now, it's different if people are deliberately trying to sculpt something in their writing. Okay, fine. But this was just the way they normally talked. And giving that up and getting eroded makes it harder and harder to manage complex thoughts. We have to be able to manage complex thoughts to wage the spiritual war. We have to bring every thought into captivity. We have to tear down arguments. That's what the spiritual war is. You mentioned Simon Brace. He's got a talk, I'm sure it's on YouTube somewhere, on the spiritual war. And I think a lot of people think of demonic possessions and all these things that they see in horror movies. You go, okay, but the real spiritual war is a battle over ideas. It's a battle about the truth. That's what the war is on.
And if you read 2 Corinthians, it says it's to break down arguments and strongholds and every lofty opinion. Well, on the language topic, that's just one of the reasons. One more of the reasons that I feel so privileged to study with you guys at SES, because my current subject is writing and research with Mrs. Woodside, and just learning English grammar in that regard. It's amazing, and it's definitely so necessary.
Well, so it's also, and I appreciate so much the bilinguals that I know in South Africa. One of the papers that was given at the Academia conference this past year was basically trying to manage the vocabulary of classical philosophical thinking, Aristotle up through Aquinas, but also Plato, whatever. And not only the Greek, but the Latin, and then the English, but the Afrikaans. And the point of his paper was, and the paper was in Afrikaans, more or less saying, hey guys, we've got to be able to make sure that we're able to stay up with the way the Greek and the Latin and the English, to whatever degree they've been able to stay up with the complexities of this philosophical conversation, because things like the attributes of God are essential to have this conversation. So he had this very interesting chart of where he thought the Afrikaans word was more comparable to what the English, Latin, and Greek would say, and where he thought there was maybe, hey, we need some work here of really coming up. Fascinating talk.
That sounds
listening
fascinating.
To the translator, simultaneous translator. But what an interesting thing. So, God bless you guys in fighting it in several languages. I mean, I'm still working on my English here as an American. So God bless you trying to do it in multiple languages there, and it's so critically important.
No, thank you very much. And also, I think it's a good place to end today's episode. But before we go, where can people find out more about you and get in touch with the work that you're doing?
So a couple of places. My website, Rebecca and I have a website, richardghowe.com. In a moment of profound humility, I bought and named an internet domain after myself. So richardghowe.com. That's where I make the joke. Don't forget the G there. And I'm not a web developer, as you'll discover pretty quickly, but it's fairly static, but all the links work. A lot of resources there that you can explore. And also ses.edu is the seminary. And check out, if you're not interested in a degree necessarily, check out the possibility of auditing some courses there. Would love to have you on board. Everything's done through Zoom. Love to hear. And I've got students from all around the world, including you guys from South Africa. I've got some from Australia, from even far away U.S. in Alaska and Hawaii. So I love what technology's been able to enable us to do at the seminary.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. And yeah, thank you for the work that you guys are doing, and thank you for making it available and possible for us. And also thank you for coming on today's episode. I've enjoyed it a lot, really a lot.
Thanks.
Yeah. Unless you have any final thoughts, I think that is it for today.
Okay.
And
No,
do you
I'm
have
fine.
any final thoughts? Okay.
No,
Cool.
I can start making something up if you want.
No, you're quick with your jokes. I know you'll be able to. But everybody, thank you for today. Just keep on fighting for the truth. Keep on seeking the truth. Learn to think critically. Until next time, Dr. Richard, thank you very much. We'll have you. I'm looking forward to our future episodes together. To the rest of you, until next time, goodbye. Thank you for watching and or listening to Hey Culture, a podcast that wants to shine a light in the darkness. If you like this episode, please like, subscribe, share, and ring that notification bell. On Apple and Spotify, please review and rate this podcast. I'm Ryno, and this is Hey Culture.